On this episode of Unanswered Questions, I figured it's time we cover Candyman. With the new movie coming out, seemed like the appropriate time because there's a lot of unanswered questions here. So I figured we'd start off with, getting one of my own unanswered questions out of the way, and that's what happens when you actually say Candyman in the mirror 5 times. So let's give it a shot. Candyman, 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 Candyman.
The Candyman. The Candyman can. The Candyman can, cause he mixes it with love and makes the world.
I somehow figured it would be something like this.
Willy Wonka make.
Question number 1. How different is the movie than the story that it was based on? I think a lot of people have forgotten that Candyman is based on a Clive Barker story in the first place, and it's pretty easy to see why, since they're pretty different stories at the root of it, and yet kind of the same. The movie version is based on Barker's story, The Forbidden, which first saw print back in 1985 in the self-published Fantasy Tales, but then was part of the Books of Blood collection that came out later that same year. Whereas some of the imagery remained the same, and the basic plot structure, the character was pretty different from what would eventually be known to audiences. Here's an image of the first depiction of the Candyman by artist Jon Stewart, which appeared in Fantasy Tales. This scraggly-haired beast of a man doesn't look much like Tony Todd, but the design behind him may seem familiar. This even differs from the description of the character from the story, in which he's a tall, lanky, pale white guy with long blonde hair and a patchwork coat. His skin is even referred to as being slightly jaundiced at one point. The plot of the story is mostly the same, although it takes place in an English slum instead of Chicago, and contains the darker element of the baby being killed instead of merely kidnapped like in the movie. Overall, they're similar stories, but with cosmetic changes that deeply influence the overall message, creating the feeling of an urban legend, changed with continual retelling. Plus, in Barker's version, the bad guy wins. Question number 2.
Why does Candyman come for the girl at the beginning?
So the movie sets up the basic lore of the villain, and it's sort of a twist on the old Bloody Mary legend. You look into a mirror and say his name 5 times, which summons him. He then appears behind you and kills you, and the introduction shows us how it happens. The woman says Candyman 5 times, and just a few seconds later, he pops up behind her, and he does the murder stuff. But, to point out, that the girl here doesn't say Candyman 5 times. Henrietta says it 4 times.
Candyman. 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 Candyman.
And then he goes downstairs. The girl only says it once.
Candyman.
Which kinda doesn't make sense. How does this even work? Anyway, what are the rules? Does it just count the mirror itself? If there's 5 people in the room and they all say Candyman 1 time, does that count? Because later on in the film, Helen and Bernie both say Candyman 4 times, with Helen adding a 5th. But if it's just about the instances, they actually say his name 9 times. Shouldn't he have appeared on the 5th time, which would have occurred when they say it together for the 3rd time, because that would have been 6 instances, passing the 5 mark. I guess you could say that it did happen, since our boy does eventually come for them both, but it's pretty different than what we see in the intro. For starters, he appears right away in that, like instantly after she says number 5, but doesn't appear for Helen until much later. Doesn't that contradict its own rules that it's set up?
Well, no, because those aren't the rules.
It's important to note that that intro scene isn't a flashback or even a side story. It's an urban legend being told to Helen for her thesis. At this point, it's one of those brothers, roommates, cousins kind of thing where the details of the story change with each telling. If this event actually happened, the facts of the tale are most likely different. We don't know who actually said the words or even when. We only know what happened for the perspective of this one storyteller who doesn't necessarily have all the deeds correct and may in fact be a totally fabricated story. So ultimately, we can ignore the specifics and just focus on the core of what they're saying, and that's that the man of candy appears in the mirror after saying his name 5 times. Plus, there was a time gap in between him saying the 4th one and her saying number 5. So, don't get me started on how the time delay works. Like if you say it 4 times one day and then come back a week later and say it once more, does that count? Question number 3.
Does Candyman even exist before Helen sees him in the parking garage?
So, while looking into the killer's background, there are several instances of his attacks. We get the introductory kill, then some reports of the death of Ruthie Jean, apparently killed by the spirit in her apartment, and also the sad tale of a mentally challenged young man that is alone in a bathroom and apparently calls him up and is castrated by him. But here's the thing, I think that none of these are even real, and the first time that this version of the Candyman is present in this reality is when he appears to Helen in the parking garage. So let's look at these appearances. The first one I addressed in the previous question, and the answer's right there. This is just a story, an urban myth passed around like Bloody Mary. In this universe, the Candyman legend appears to be a bit more widespread, and quite a few people have stories of his manifestation. Chances are that this opening encounter didn't actually happen, or if a version of it did, the events were slightly different and could easily have been a different manifestation of the legend. Ruthie was clearly just murdered by the gang in the building and made to look like a Candyman victim. That part is pretty spelled out. But the boy in the bathroom is a bit of an outlier. I won't say that this 100%, but it is of my belief that he's actually another victim of the gang leader fake Candyman and not the real deal. Mainly because the castration doesn't fit the spirit's MO. Every other person he encounters is gutted, as his favorite killing method appears to be stabbing you in the back with his hook and then cutting you open. So, why would he stop at castration here? Why would he even start with castration? It doesn't really seem like his thing, especially since the young man is left alive after the encounter. Whether or not he survived is up in the air, as it's suggested that he survived, as little Jake says that it's worse than death, but earlier he does say that a boy was killed, so his fate is a little ambiguous. But one thing is for certain, is that Candy left him alive, the only time that we see him do so. More likely it was another instance of the gang members using the story of Candyman to promote fear and terror through the buildings, using a cruel method to do so. And if that's so, then we don't actually know of any appearances by the actual killer that are totally confirmed to be him before his reveal to Helen. So this, in my interpretation, is his first physical manifestation of this version of the Candyman. Question number 4.
Is Candyman even real?
An on-running theme through the first film is that Helen is blamed for all the killings, and it certainly seems as if Daniel is, at the very least, working through her. She's present as the baby is kidnapped and the dog is killed, and she's in the apartment as Bernie is murdered, and also the psychiatrist. Who's to say that Helen's not just crazy? Could she actually have just done the murders? There's certainly a way to interpret the film that way, but you kind of have to ignore the sequels, but not 100%, as I'll talk about a little bit later. It's certainly possible that there is no Candyman at all, and that, as suggested in the film, Helen's obsessive research takes her over to the edge and she is the one doing the killings after a psychotic break. In the scene with the psychiatrist, we do see Candyman kill him and then release her hands, but it's possible that we're only seeing that through her perspective. If she was able to free her hands herself, or the restraints broke, it would be easy for her mind to interpret those events in the way that her mind is doing. The Candyman freed her. No one sees the Candyman but her, and the people that are killed, of course, but they never refer to him as being there, just that someone is killing them. In fact, Anne-Marie actually says that Helen did it. Even Candyman himself says, "It's always been you." There's a shot near the end that seems to imply that Jake sees Daniel's burning corpse in the bonfire, But again, there's no acknowledgement of what he sees, so that shot could likely be there for the audience. You could theorize that there's nothing supernatural until the very end, in which Helen actually becomes the thing that she feared herself. I mean, she had been doing these things under the guise of a supernatural force that's called through the mirror, but now has fully crossed over into the role. Now, I don't think that's a definitive thing that the movie is saying, but it is certainly an interpretation of it that does work. Question number 5.
Why give him a hook for a hand?
This one just doesn't make much sense to me because the Candyman's backstory is that he was a slave's son who fell in love with a white woman, so was murdered by the townspeople. They attack him, cut off his hand, and smear him with honey, which causes a bunch of bees that they've brought with them to sting him to death, which is all pretty elaborate and all, and possibly the most perplexing method to kill someone that I could think of. Like, you and your little lynch mob are sitting around planning to kill someone, and one of them shouts, "Let's bee him to death," and everyone says, "Okay, we were thinking hanging or burning or something, but let's roll with this whole bee thing." But it's a bunch of people who are so horrified by a black man being in love with a white woman that they have to torture him to death. So I'm thinking that they're not too bright to begin with. Anyway, to add insult to injury, literally, they also place a big jagged metal hook in place of where his hand used to be for reasons. But I mean, they're sort of putting a weapon in his grasp. Plus, if it was just for torture's sake, then why a big metal hook? Surely there's other things that they could jam up the stump to inflict pain. I mean, what were they even doing with that hook out there in the first place? Somebody just brought that along? Did they plan that out, or did someone just have it? Like, they just cut off his hand and someone shouted, "We should stick something up there," and this one guy was like, "Oh, hey, I have this in my pocket, let's try this." Well, the actual answer for this one is simple.
They didn't. There was no hook.
I mean, it's debatable that there was even a Daniel Robitaille, at least in the context in the first movie. The Candyman is an urban legend. The movie tells us this as plain as day, and like most urban legends, the story is either not true or the details have become twisted over time. How many legends of an escaped killer involve them having a hook for a hand? Daniel's story might be rooted in the truth, but the details were most likely altered over time in order to make them more garish and horrifying. And a guy with bees in his mouth and a hook for a hand is pretty horrific. So they were added in over time. And Candyman is the embodiment of that legend. It's not literally Daniel. It's a story of what he's become come to life. He makes a comment at one point about belief in him being important, and seemingly those beliefs also shape him. Question number 6.
How does the hook work anyway?
This is a question for the sequels, because in the first film, the hook is handled pretty well, but starting with part 2, Candyman just seems capable of pushing his whole damn hook thing through a person. I mean, take a look at what I mean. Okay, here's his hook. By definition, it is hook-shaped, which means that the pointed end is actually facing inward. The front part is this rounded part, which is not an edge. It doesn't look sharp at all. Then please tell me how it's able to do this. Seriously, look at this. It's like clean through him. In the first film, you don't really see his hand, but the impression is that he curves his arm to stick the pointed end in and then pulls upward, which is where the whole gutting thing comes in. But he's not doing that here. He just stabs in like it's a sharp knife blade. So I guess what they're saying with this all is that his brute strength is so great that he's able to push the entire hook through someone's body with just force, which makes his strength levels through the roof. But it's probable that he's also assisted by good old magic. Question number 7.
Well, if there is a Candyman and it isn't just Helen, why would he need to cover up his crimes?
The main focus of the first film, and a portion of the second, is that people are accused of the killings as Daniel appears to have set things up in order to frame them. But, as he states in the film, his powers and presence are built on belief. Fear of him is what feeds his strength and empowers him. So wouldn't it be better to not frame Helen? Without someone to blame, there's still a question of whether the Candyman did it, which fuels the whole belief structure of things. I suppose that plays into the ending of the film, which would have turned this whole thing on its ear. You have this woman who is seemingly killing people but blaming the Candyman, and yet in the end, the plan was for the people of the Green to find Helen and the baby's body in the bonfire, thereby making it questionable whether she was responsible or not in the first place. This would have fueled the belief in the Candyman legend, since there would be no way of knowing what had happened in the flames. So the belief may have just become that the Candyman took them in there to kill them, but also keep it vague if Helen did it herself. It plays with people's beliefs in just the right way, especially considering the already wary nature of the residents. Finding those bodies would have had the police marking it as closed case, but the locals would wonder if there was something more going on, stoking the embers of their burning beliefs. Question number 8.
Is Candyman political?
Yes, of course it is. That's a dumb question. Why would you even ask that? Well, I did. I asked that just to raise a point that comes up a lot nowadays. In light of the new version of the film coming out, along with recent trends in horror, lots of people online are decrying the current shift towards horror films with politically motivated themes, longing to return to a time when horror movies weren't political.
But this movie's 30 years old, and it's political as hell.
I mean, I could point out that there's political horror films going all the way back to the Universal monsters, but given that there's a current surge in films dealing with racial themes in horror, it's interesting to point back towards this one to show that it's not like it's some sort of new trend. This movie deals with Cabrini Green, which was an infamous housing project in Chicago, and the types of things that they're talking about in this movie are not fiction. This was the film actually discussing real-life issues that were occurring, and Bernard Rose met with the NAACP about including the buildings and their plight in his film. Now, it would be foolish to attempt to get into the history of the Green in this video, since it could literally be the video, but there's plenty of information about it out there, and the neglect that it received, leading to its eventual demolition in the late 90s, at which point a number of residents were again abandoned. The film was considered to have helped shine a bit of light on the community's concerns, and racial tensions are a huge theme in the film, from Daniel's origins to the residents' distrust of any authority figures offering help, and it's clear that the film had a message, even if the sequels largely ditched a lot of this subtext for more straightforward horror films, though they did retain traces of the themes. Question number 9.
What happens in that ending?
So the ending of the first film isn't too terribly vague, but I actually think it's really misunderstood. It's seen as sort of a dark finale, with Helen becoming a spectral force of evil herself, joining the Candyman on the dark side. I've seen people describe it as them being reunited and his legend lives on and she's now a part of it, but that's not what this film is about. I mean, at least the first film. This one is about stories and legends, and Candyman continuing his. His whole motive in the first film is to keep his story going, to stoke the fears of his presence, adding to his power and longevity. It's the perpetuation of his story through the gangs and the killings in the Green that keep him going, and Helen is his ticket to spreading the influence further. His goal in the end is to make people believe that the Candyman is responsible for the fire and the death of Helen and the baby, locking his legend down forever. But in saving the baby and giving her life to do so, Helen wins. She wins by becoming the story. I mean, as seen as her funeral, she's now considered a great tragic hero by the residents, and the ending represents her story now superseding his. She is now the local legend. Candyman, he's destroyed. The fire doesn't kill him. The disregard of the belief in him does. Not only has she defeated him, She has become him, which is why it's now her mural on the wall. The version of the Candyman is gone forever, completely destroyed and now disregarded, while Helen's legend now lives on. It's not really clear if she would actually become a continual spirit of vengeance or if her murderous ways are reserved specifically for her ex, but one thing's for sure is that killing him just ensures that it's her story that continues. Question number 10.
Speaking of Helen, is she the reincarnation of Daniel's lost love?
Even though it's never outright spoken in the movie, it's heavily implied that she's a reborn version of Caroline, his lover, and that he was killed for being with. Evidence towards this are his seeming fascination for her, his message that it was always her, implying that she was always the woman for him, and the similarities between her and the painting of her on the wall. But I'm not totally convinced on this for a few reasons. Let me take that backwards. First of all, there's the picture on the wall, which, to be fair, maybe it's just me, but it doesn't really look anything like her. I mean, there's a resemblance, I guess. And besides, it's not like it's some sort of historical document. It's a painting by the gang members, most likely. Much of the paintings and razor blade candy from earlier were theirs. It's not like that painting has been around since the 1800s, since the building wasn't even there. Other than that, there's the message of it was always you, which doesn't really mean that she was a reincarnation. It could simply be an indication of his obsession with her. She could simply resemble her enough for Daniel to feel an affinity for her and form an unhealthy attachment. I mean, as unhealthy as a spiritual murder demon can be, like, by definition, I think all of his attachments would be unhealthy, but there's just no link to show that she's a full-on reincarnation, because if she was, the coincidences would be ridiculous. The odds of a reincarnation being in the same general area, doing a thesis on legends that just happens to delve into Candyman territory, and just by coincidence, saying his name 5 times. More likely, the scenario is this. Helen does her thesis, does the mirror thing, attracting his attention. She bears a resemblance to his lost love, so he's now intrigued, but her whole mission is to basically ruin everything that he's crafted. She's going into buildings to show that the mysterious stuff happening there is simply people being terrible, nothing supernatural, which is concerning to him since that ruins his whole power source. She's dispelling belief in the legend, so of course he has to counter that, putting his own nefarious plan into motion. Question number 11.
Where exactly did Daniel die?
In the first film, in recounting the Candyman's origins, Purcell here gives the origin of Daniel Robitaille and talks about his death occurring right here in Chicago on the same grounds that Cabrini Green was eventually built upon. And yet, in the sequel, Farewell to the Flesh, when they tell his backstory once again, the location has been moved to New Orleans. So, which one is correct?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think it's important to note that if you take the first movie on its own, in a bubble, with no sequels, there's a chance that Daniel Robitaille doesn't even exist.
In the context of just that film, he could simply be a folktale that has been told into existence with no aspects of it actually being true. Simply a local legend that's been told so many times that it's just become a part of the local history. The second film, introducing relatives to Daniel himself, kind of eliminates that and pulls the character into reality. But the question remains of which reality is correct and where was he killed? And to me, this one's an easy answer, considering the things that we've already talked about. Considering the family ties in the second film, it's a pretty safe bet that that's where Daniel was actually killed, and the true basis of his history is in New Orleans. But does that make Purcell totally wrong? Well, not really, since again, we're dealing with a story and different aspects of the same tale. Urban legends change through the telling, with the details being altered through time and multiple versions of the same legend existing and yet sharing common details. Because of that, the Candyman in Chicago actually was killed in Chicago, or at least as far as he knows, because he's bound to his own story. And when people spread that version, and Considering that Purcell wrote a book about his legend and most likely based the character in Chicago, that version is probably ending up the most common and known. In the second film, the residents of New Orleans tell the story differently in their version. He was killed there, and again, they're most likely the ones that are correct, but ultimately, it doesn't really matter overall. Question number 12.
Is there more than one Candyman?
So the trailer for the new Candyman movie that comes out this year seems to focus on a new Candyman with a different origin, and the teaser trailer hinted at there being multiple Candymen, so that seems like a new take on the character. But take a look at what I've been saying all throughout this video, and you'll see that there's always been multiple Candymans, men's. Again, this character is not a fixed reality of one guy. What we've seen of him so far are localized legends. Urban legends vary from area to area, with dramatic character changes being a part of how the stories are told. As they get passed down, details change. Hell, I mean, in the first 3 movies, I'm pretty sure that we're seeing 4 different versions of him. We've already talked about how the guy from the first movie and the second one are most likely 2 different aspects of the same legend, with 2 different points of origin. But there's also some dramatic differences even between the second one and the third. In part 2, the Candyman has a point of power in the mirror in which the soul was trapped and when he was killed, and that's why he appears in the mirror. The mirror aspect of his death was not included in the first film, and yet after the mirror is destroyed, he's still able to come back for a third entry. In that film, though, there's no mention of the mirror at all, and instead it's told that his point of power is his paintings, which apparently contain all of his goodness. If you destroy the goodness, then the evil cannot survive, and serves as yet another way to get rid of him. The reason for this is something hinted at in the new trailers, and that Candyman isn't a man, he's a story, and stories change. And there's more than one version of those stories. Hell, try to explain Spider-Man's origin to someone, and you will get 7 different answers, depending upon whether someone's going by the 60s version, ultimate version, movie version, rebooted movie version, cartoon version, or like any of the other 100 versions of his origin. Candyman can't really die as long as his story is told, and his story is clearly spread through the fibers of the US, even in the original trilogy. The way that he manifests is contingent upon the beliefs of the storytellers and summoners. So in the first film, it was told that his death occurred in Chicago, so that was his reality. And it worked because that was the story. Keep in mind, at the ending of each of these films, as Candyman is killed, he's dead. That aspect of the story is ended. Belief in the story could manifest a new version, but it's a separate entity bound to the rules of the new story that's told. That's why the third film version has yet another weakness. 20-some years had passed between second part and the third part, and as the story changed, so his reality changed. It could just be an extension of this, with the story changing throughout the ages and eras and areas to be new manifestations, with the Candyman entity taking on the forms of the stories told. Question number 13.
Is there any relation between Candyman and the Cenobites?
All right. Hear me out on this one. Both are created by Clive Barker. Both are entities that are referred to as demons. Both will only come to you if they are called. Both seem to talk in the same cryptic methods, poetically, frequently referring to elements of pain mixing with pleasure. I'm sure that it's just an author working through a theme, but I like to think that the Candyman entity could be an aspect of hell. I mean, after all, Kirsty stated that there were multiple portals there, and Hellraiser Media has always referenced other regions of hell, not as obsessed with the S&M culture kind of thing that they have going on in Leviathan's digs. Considering he seems to sort of follow the same general rulebook that the Cenobites stick to, just in a different methodology, I see them as being a part of the same realm. I know it's just my headcanon, but god damn it, let me have this.
So there you have it. It is 13 questions that I think I answered pretty well. Kind of bummed out that I didn't get my own officially out of the way. Try one more time. We'll try it again. Just see what happens. Candyman, 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 Candyman.
Candyman, Candyman, Candyman.
It's just not the same. All right. Well, anyhow, let me know what you thought of these answers down below. Let me know if you have any other questions about this series. I have a feeling that with the new movie, some of these might end up getting changed or altered. I guess we'll find out in the near future whether or not that actually happens. But of course, please like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. Certainly appreciate it. Even if you hit that bell to make sure that you get the notifications of when new videos come out. And then, of course, support the Patreon by going to patreon.com/movietimelines, where you can help to support the channel. And up like these guys, right? Like these guys do right here. These guys are awesome for doing so. Thank you for helping to keep this channel going and helping keep these videos coming to you twice weekly. So, help it out a little bit. I appreciate you watching as well, too. So thank you very much. And we'll see you very, very shortly for another great video. Thank you, guys, and goodbye.